Reverend Suzanne my really long intro. Sorry about that. Next time you get a shorter one. I just came from Charleston, South Carolina, where the Centers for Spiritual Living National Convention was held. And the theme, which was on the front cover of the January Science of Mind, is a grand rising. It shows here outside. A grand rising. And people used that as a greeting when they were there. And then the theme of my talk, which I just told Reverend Suzanne was divine discontent, is actually divine discomfort. Same thing, basically. But in my brain, they lived in the same place. I'll show this to them. And that's the February Science of Mind magazine. They were both amazing. And the cover of the February is just like a stunning, stunning thing. So I want to tell you a little bit about the conference and what it might have to do with you, and also divine discontent in an election cycle. It's all connected. So first, the good news and the bad news is that everything that you might have discontent with, everything we might have discontent with, whether it's in the election, whether it's in any change that is occurring that is new, like in Centers for Spiritual Living, or in your family, or in the climate, or anything, we created. We created it. We created it with, at a minimum, we created it with consciousness. And this is what I know to be the truth from studying the quantum physics of consciousness, of spirituality. Because at the level of the quantum field, the physicists will tell us there is nothing but light. There's just waves of light that can be collapsed into particles. That's all there is. There is nothing about this beautiful room that we're in, or the geese honking, or the chairs, or each beautiful person here or online that could possibly be predicted from looking at the ground well-being. There's nothing about it. It could just as easily be anything else. And physicists, people who just sit around doing really complex mathematical proofs, say that it is consciousness that collapses a wave into particle, which makes it into something that we think is real. What? Has anybody heard this before and been a little bit familiar with this concept? It's kind of mind-blowing if you take it to its logical extension. I tend to believe, and with no mathematical proof, that there is, and I think the quantum physicist that taught me most of what I know, Dr. Amit Goswami, seems to subscribe to this as well. And certainly, Ernest Holm, the founders of Centers for Spiritual Living and Science of Mind, would say that there is a collective consciousness, not just individual consciousness, right? And so that the and physicists sort of talk about it this way too. They say if there's, let's just say, that tree out there, that particular tree has a 99.9% chance of continuing to look like that tree because we agree that that tree is there, and that there is such a thing as a tree, and that there's such a thing as that particular kind of tree, and so we have agreed that that's it. Same thing with a mountain, which seems even more like permanent, right? A mountain only exists because it only has a high probability of existing. And it's not just that somebody could come along and put dynamite under the mountain and blow it up, right, which humans have done. It's that our consciousness could blow it up by deciding that it is no longer a mountain. Which means that every single thing we see, including politics, comes from our collective consciousness, which has created this and is now often, not everybody, but a lot of us are uncomfortable with different things happening in the world, whether it's the perceived climate change, whether it's Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. warring with each other, whether it's people starting to say their pronouns all the time. So at the one of the things that one of the affirmations and chants that really my favorite chant affirmation that comes straight out of Science of Mind was sung to us from the stage at the Centers for Spiritual Living by Eddie Watkins Jr. Any of you fans of his? It was such a treat because he's on the East Coast to spend all this time in the room with Eddie Watkins Jr. doing a ton of the music there. It was just so wonderful. So he sang, "There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect. That life is my life now. There's only," feel free to join in with me, I'm going to say it a few times. "There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect. That life is my life now. There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect. That life is my life now." Do you feel that vibration after you do that? That is telling us and bringing me back to the fact that everything is spirit. Same thing as everything is, the ground of all being is behind everything. And everything is possible in God, in spirit, in consciousness. Everything. So I want you to remember that as you go through this time. In the Centers for Spiritual Living Convention, person after person got up and speaker and gave their pronouns along with their name, and also told their ancestors. I wasn't a speaker there, so I didn't get a chance to say my pronouns. I learned that most people would say, if they were going to say their ancestors, most people who were maybe looked like me might say something, and this would be true. Like, on my mother's side, I am Scottish and Welsh, and on my father's side, I am English. And that would be true. I actually ended up in prayer, and after hearing Reverend Andrea Earle speak about divine discomfort and her amazing series in here, I ended up identifying for myself that it's also true that on my father's side, the ancestors took vast tracts of land from the Agua Caliente Indians and then handed down inherited wealth to me. And on the mother's side, multiple ancestors were owners of people, or said they were, and that they called slaves, and handed down inherited wealth to me. So, and my mother was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in the so-called cradle of the Confederacy, in a house where they had separate entrances for Black people and Jewish people, because that was the law when she was born in 1933 in Charleston, South Carolina. And she eventually married a northerner, which was my father from California. I love that they refer to him as a northerner. And moved to Southern California, and he became a radical left-wing professor. And she had a very different life from the debutante first family of Charleston kind of life that she was raised to have. But she said that the contradictions were there and were passed down to me. So all of that kind of augmented a discomfort for me at the Centers for Spiritual Living, but also just interest in, wow, all these things coming together. We learned by our visit to the International Museum, African American Museum, that Charleston, South Carolina, Gadsden's Wharf was where historians estimate between 40 and 60% of all Africans in bondage brought to the U.S. entered the U.S. So just a huge, like, interesting energy of that space, and then that that we learned about the Gullah Geechee culture down there, which is a particular blend of African, of some West African words and cultures and foods, and an American, uniquely American, that happened in slave life and on the islands there. And people talked about this. By the end of the conference, in a listening session that Reverend Sonny Cantrell, the spiritual leader of Centers for Spiritual Living, and the other leadership of the International Centers for Spiritual Living held. And it was a beautiful listening session because it was truly listening. They just passed, is anybody else there that's in this room? Online, yeah. They passed the microphone around like a talking stick to everyone, and they never responded once. They just allowed each person to say what they needed to say, which was really beautiful. By that time, even speakers who weren't planning to were introducing themselves with their pronouns, and most of the people who spoke in that room introduced themselves with their pronouns and said, "This is the first time I'm ever doing this. I haven't ever done this before. I haven't ever seen why I would do it, since it's obvious what my pronouns are." And I had learned a few years ago, the penny had dropped for me, that that's the reason, right? The reason I say my pronouns is because it's obvious, because that gives permission for the people for whom it is not obvious to say their pronouns. It normalizes that some people don't have he, she, or pronouns the way they all did when I was growing up, right? When I was growing up, when most of us were growing up in this room, that was not a thing that occurred. Sometimes you would hear about people who had changed from one gender expression to another, but then their pronouns would change, and it still wasn't something where we went around saying them. There was one man who stood up in the listening session, and he said that he is a white male who was born male, and he did not say his pronouns. And he said he didn't know what was his place in the Centers for Spiritual Living anymore, as a person who wasn't African American, wasn't trans, wasn't gay, wasn't, and you know, he could have been speaking for any number of people in America too, many of whom are expressing themselves in very visible ways, at feeling like they're not a part of anymore. And an African American woman, actually I don't really remember what the identification of the person who stood up was, but they weren't male or white. So I think it was a black African American, a black woman. And she stood up and said, "I want to thank you, sir, for staying in the room, for speaking your truth. I need you to stay here. I need you to stay here so that I can redefine what it is for me that somebody is a white male who was born that way, white heterosexual male. So I can have a whole different experience of what that is." And staying in the room is so much a part of what I would invite us to really look at for dealing with divine discomfort, right? It's just staying in the room, noticing, this is uncomfortable. And can we all just breathe? It's uncomfortable when people change. It's uncomfortable when new stuff gets talked about. It's uncomfortable when I've changed, you know, in the community I live in downtown Sacramento, there were 8 kids who grew up together, 2 of them ours, and of those 8 kids, 5 of them are identifying with different pronouns than they were assigned at birth. So this is, and that's, I don't know, maybe because they grew up in Southside Park co-housing, they felt a little more permission to do it. But it's what's happening. It's what's happening in our whole country, that people are identifying in ways, and it's not just pronouns. Pronouns and gender expression is just an example of something that is changing and that we have an opportunity to be uncomfortable with, or comfortable with, or comfortable with someone else's discomfort, right? Or uncomfortable with someone else's discomfort, and just notice all those things. And stay in the room anyway. And there's so much in today's politics that actually is sort of leaving the room. Have you noticed? Just like, no, not going to deal with you anymore. Whoever you are, whoever the you is, they're an other, they're not me, they don't agree like me, they don't vote like me, or they don't not vote like me, or whatever it is, and I'm just not. And that's the way of dealing with discomfort. Anybody ever taken that particular way? You could someone did a pinky raise. That's kind of a way of like, I don't really want to raise my whole hand. I have done that. I mean, I haven't mostly had to, because I've mostly been surrounded by people who think like me. In Charleston, I organized a reunion of my cousins who are all live in the South, and it's a little different. It was a little different. And we were in South Carolina, and it was in the middle of the primary. Yeah? So it was a little different. Yeah. And I'm not making any assumptions about where anybody is on the spectrum of all this stuff. I'm just talking about this. So I'd like to invite all of us to stay in the room of society and vote. If there's anything that anybody is uncomfortable with that's happening in politics, then not voting is really just a way of voting for that. That's a way of voting for it to continue. So when I vote, I just explained at the beginning that consciousness created everything. So so I voted through consciousness already. So whether you know it or not, you already voted for Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or they wouldn't be here, okay? You voted for both of them. Your people going to be like, no, I didn't! But, okay, just notice that. You did. I did. I did vote for both of them, or they wouldn't be here. The way in which I may have voted might have been just by resisting, by mocking, by being disgusted, by pushing away. That is a form of voting. What you resist persists. That's voting in consciousness. And if I don't vote, if I literally don't vote, now I have voted in consciousness for what I don't want, and now I've not voted again, and now I've voted twice for what I don't want. So in voting is an act of consciousness to create what we want. If you say, well, the choices, I don't like the choices, too bad. Pick one. I mean, in Sacramento, we have multiple races right now, local races where there's 5 or 6 people running. You have to pick one. Get educated. If any of you want to know what I'm voting for in Sacramento or statewide, you can ask me and I will tell you. I'm not going to say it up here, but happy to share that with you. I have a blog and a newsletter, which rarely is making election recommendations, just in an election cycle, but mostly is talking about spiritual stuff and what I like. And many of you may have been handed a card. Many of you already signed up for my newsletter. But if you didn't sign up, you get a free love meditation, nothing political, with beautiful music from Dennis Merritt Jones. And then you can always unsubscribe if you don't like it. How do we stay in the room? How do we deal with discomfort? Two things I want to leave you with on that. One is just love, the practice of love. One of my favorite stories, which actually was in a Science of Mind magazine a long time ago, so maybe you read it if you read that magazine. Martin Luther King, at one point, he and his group of people were going to meet with Robert Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General of the United States. And you may think, in retrospect, of the Cole Kennedy administration as being a big ally of Martin Luther King, but in that particular time, they were suspicious of the King people, were suspicious of the Kennedys, were suspicious of the federal government. A lot of them didn't see the point of meeting with him, and they were really, grouchy about it, didn't want to do it. And Reverend Dr. King said, okay, well, we're not meeting with him until Friday. It's Monday, making these days up, but I think it was roughly like that. So we're going to stay in a room and ask God to make us love him. And we're not going to go to that meeting until we love him. And they stayed in that room, and they waited until every single one of them felt love in their hearts. And then they walked into that room with Robert Kennedy, and he said yes to almost everything they were asking. He said yes to the federal government helping to end segregation. He said yes. He said yes, and they did not expect a yes until they loved him, and then they let it go, which was collapsing consciousness into a new possibility and a new reality. I want you to imagine what it would be like if you were able to have love in your heart for the politicians that you are being suspicious of or ignoring, or just like la 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 la. And instead you let that discomfort in and you sat there. Maybe you did Ho'oponopono, if you know that, or something else. And that, I'm going to suggest the Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen. Anybody ever done this? That I really love because it's sort of the opposite of a lot of meditations we do where we breathe in light and breathe out light, pretending that there's no darkness or discomfort that's happening. Breathe in light, breathe out light. Oh yes, that's who I am. Well, a lot of times it's not. So no matter where the discomfort is, if it's political, family, or whatever, let's just do a little now, and then we'll take this right into prayer. So just breathe in that yuck, this and stuck, and and breathe that in, and breathe out light. Breathe in judgment and hatred, and why did they do that, and why is he so old, and why is he such a liar, and all those things, and breathe out light and love. I've heard it said that the discomfort, the yuck that we're breathing in is like a spiritual Brillo pad that scrubs off the separation between us and other people, us and the world, us and other parties, us and other family members, us and others. There is no separation, God. There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect. That life is my life now. There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect. That life is my life now. And so it is. Woo!